After 118 days, the end credits are finally rolling on the actors' strike. There was a lot at stake here about the future of Hollywood, from what we see on screen to how people get paid when we stream their shows. Today, who really won, actors or studios? I'm Amil Niazi, sitting in for Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. Okay, at 12:01 this morning, the strike officially ended. Just shy of 4 months, it was the longest strike ever for film and television actors. Movies, TV shows, they all ground to a halt. And you know, it could still be months before things actually get back to normal. One of the reasons it took so long is because there were a lot of complex issues on the table. Things actors and studios have never really had to deal with before. Things like artificial intelligence. Kathryn VanArendonk is here to talk about the tentative deal both sides just reached. Hey, Kathryn.
Good morning.
Now, we normally reach you at home in New Jersey, but today, oh my gosh, we're so lucky. You are right in the heart of it in Los Angeles. What's the mood like there right now?
I think everyone is relieved and exhausted and a little exasperated that it has taken this long to get to this place. But I think everyone is just incredibly anxious to get back to doing their jobs, to being able to promote the work that they have done. And I think part of what feels so notable about this is after the writer's strike ended, there was a lot of talk about like, all right, actors, going to take a week, you know, and we're going to be back to work. It's maybe even by Halloween, everything's going to be all sorted. And there was instead this real insistence that like, no, this is a moment that we need to take and actually iron out every single thing we possibly can in this contract. And so instead it has taken several more weeks than I think some people were expecting. And now there is just this immense relief that finally a deal has been reached.
I can only imagine. You know, on that stickiness, the fact that it took this extra time, you know, there was a lot of talk about last, best, final offers, about what they actually needed to get this over the line. Can you walk us through some of what those points were and what they couldn't agree on until just yesterday?
Yes. So also, as with the writer's strike, there was word over the weekend that the studios had presented what they were insisting was their last, best, and final, which is a phrase that I love very much because last and final mean the same things. You don't need both of those words, but they're clearly trying to some kind of tactic that says, like, we're not going to change anything about this. And then, wouldn't you know it, the studios or the SAG-AFTRA released a statement that said, actually, this has a truly nightmarish AI deal and we will not be signing it. And so instead, there was still another round of back and forth before they were able to reach an agreement. The AI deal that had been in that last and final offer was something that SAG was very happy to be able to say, like, we cannot sign this. It allowed studios to use scans of people without their consent. It allowed studios to use scans of deceased celebrities without asking for the consent of their estates. And so, you know, you got a lot of just incredulous and truly upset responses to that. And so instead, they went back a couple more times. And it does seem like they have reached an AI agreement that includes consent and compensation. As is the case with most of this deal, though, we don't really have the specific nitty-gritty details of what that is. And so people are watching very closely to see what this will actually look like over the next couple days.
Well, you touched on the AI part, but another big sticking point was streaming residuals. And we know that actors do not get paid the same when their show is running, you know, a show like Suits on Netflix, sort of in perpetuity. I know we don't know the details of the contract, but what are you hearing about where they're at when it comes to streaming residuals?
What we have so far is basically this statement that SAG released They say that it is a $1 billion deal. It has like the biggest increase in minimum wages, and that it also, like the writer's contract, has a new language for how to create residuals for streaming programs. We do not have the details about what that's going to look like yet. In the writer's strike, that involved the writer's new contract involves giving residuals for shows that are only performing above a certain percentage threshold for each streaming platform. We don't have a sense yet whether the SAG residuals will look like that or whether there's a different model. The other thing to remember is that for SAG and for the WGA, the goal was not necessarily to get the best possible numbers that they could. The goal was to create any kind of structure so that they can negotiate in the future on a structure that already exists, rather than the situation where they have been, which is like, no, we simply don't pay you for this. Mm-hmm. Like, this is not something that we need to talk about. It's so much easier to say, like, bump that number up a percentage than to create that permission in the first place. So that really feels like the major win here.
Is this something, SAG is celebrating? Like, are they coming out of here drinking champagne and popping bottles, or are they just satisfied that people can finally get back to work?
There is champagne bottle popping for sure. Like, I think everyone is so happy that this was not a rubber stamp deal. I think everyone is doing a little backwards looking at the DGA, which made a very fast deal even though it looked like everyone else was going to really hold out for a new paradigm of what these contracts can look like. But it really remains to be seen. And it was a unanimous vote in favor of this deal as far as the SAG negotiating committee. But it does remain to be seen, once the more specific details of what the deal looks like comes out, how the sort of membership at large responds.
Okay, Kathryn, quickly, final question to you. What changes for the average viewer, now that the strike is over?
Well, it hopefully is going to be that everything starts to get back into production pretty soon. But it really, the end of the strike means that we slowly start to get back to something like where we were, except that studios have been kind of holding on to things for projects so that there's never been this huge gulf of content. What we will instead feel is a slowing down of the big projects, because there is this backlog of work that has not been done. SVU is going to have probably a 13-episode season instead of standard 22, but 13 is, better than nothing.
Exactly.
And thank God you're going to be able to see all the celebrities out talking about their projects again. And we all love that really ridiculous press tour stuff. So that's one of my favorite shows, and it's coming back.
Oh, I mean, that's why we're all here, right? Kathryn, thank you so much for taking time to chat with us while you're in LA.
Thanks for having me.
Kathryn VanArendonk is a TV critic at Vulture. We reached her in Los Angeles. The new union's members still have to ratify the contract. And for the latest on the tentative deal, you can go to CBC News. Well, from the actors' strike to one of Hollywood's most famous families, director Sofia Coppola grew up in a family of famous filmmakers, and it's hard not to think of that when you're watching her own movies. So many of them explore what it's like to be an average teenage girl who sort of comes of age directly adjacent to celebrity. And her latest muse is no exception, Priscilla Presley, the wife of Elvis. Here's a little bit of her new film, Priscilla.
Hi. What's your name?
Priscilla Presley.
You like Elvis Presley?
Just what is the intent here, Mr. Presley? You got women throwing themselves at you. Why my daughter?
Well, sir, I happen to be very fond of your daughter. She's much more mature than her age. Black hair and more eye makeup.
I don't know if I like it.
Am I the only one tempted to do an Elvis accent after listening to that? Priscilla is an adaptation of the 1985 memoir Elvis and Me by Priscilla herself. It tells the story of their relationship from her perspective, starting with their meeting in 1959 when Priscilla was just 14 and Elvis was 24. Two film critics are here to talk with me about the new movie, Alison Willmore and Jackson Weaver. Thank you guys so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us, yeah.
Okay, Alison, let me start with you. What did you love about Priscilla?
I think the things I love the most are, one, it is such a Sofia Coppola topic. You know, I think even when this film was announced, I was like, this is exactly in her wheelhouse of like being about a teenage girl surrounded by glitz and luxury, but also having a certain definitely a lack of agency, and that's certainly the case in Priscilla. I think the thing that this movie does best for me is that it simultaneously puts you in the mindset of this teenage girl who is, you know, from her perspective, having like a fairy tale come true, you know, like the most famous, you know, star on earth is choosing her and wants to be around her and wants to like scoop her up and like bring her to his, you know, Memphis palace of and marry her eventually. And at the same time, you're always aware of how disturbing so much of this is. Not to like, you know, Kaylee Spaney, who plays Priscilla and who is great. I think she looks so young in the beginning. It really, the movie does not, you know, not like Riverdale or something where you're like, these 30-somethings are teenagers. Sure. She looks like she's still a child. And I think that the movie is very unstinting about that in a way that I appreciated.
And Jackson, what about you? What are your thoughts on the film?
Thoughts, loves. I mean, I'm not an Elvis guy. I don't know a ton of Sofia Coppola's history and movies that she's put out. But one of my favorite things about this movie is just that it exists, and like what we're talking about now is Priscilla and like the holdovers and Poor Things coming out soon. It's not just, you know, Marvel fare. So it just, this movie being an exciting movie for people is exciting to me because of the way it was made. The story is told as well. It's kind of very spare and sparse in its telling. It's about Priscilla's lack of agency, literally lack of anything to do for large parts of her life, where she's swept up, taken basically out of high school when she's 14, and then for years and years after has no other outside influences in her life. So it's about what she is missing, and that is a difficult story to tell and make it interesting. And I think it does a really, really good job of evoking the sort of feelings that come with that without hitting you over the head with messages, etc. It reminds me a lot of Pablo Larraín's Spencer, which is just criminally underrated. I love that movie with Kristen Stewart about Princess Diana. And that movie also shows somebody who has been kind of caught in a gilded cage. And those are difficult stories to tell. This one does it well.
Alison, you know, you mentioned sort of this teenager feeling out of place. It felt very much like she was an outsider looking into her own life. And I think that's a theme in a lot of Sofia Coppola's films. You know, I mentioned she is the daughter of director Francis Ford Coppola. He did The Godfather, Apocalypse Now. She made The Bling Ring about rich teenagers. Somewhere was about a teenage daughter of a movie star. What does this film add to that kind of canon that she's built of teenage girlhood?
Well, I think this film specifically, and I think it's not always something that it handles well, but I think this film specifically is about like growing up and out of, you know, being this teenager in thrall with this megastar, you know, that I think it's funny. This film is so, Coppola is like famous for doing, for the style of her films, for the music, for the costuming, you know, for the aesthetics. And I think in this case, the aesthetics play a huge part in the kind of growth of this character. You know, Elvis early on, I think we heard a clip of it, tells her, you know, you can't wear prints, like you're too small for that. Yes. And you should dye your hair black because it'll make your eyes pop more. And she does it because she, you know, you don't say no to Elvis. You're 14, 15 years old. Wow. And then later we see her as she's pulling away and kind of finding herself. We see her in the exact sort of dress he told her she couldn't wear. I think that it explores the ways in which this teenage girl grows up. It is as much a coming of age movie as it is one about this specific marriage.
Yes, totally. You know, Alison mentioned the music, Jackson, and this is going to surprise a lot of people. There's no Elvis music in this Elvis movie, but yet it was a very Sofia soundtrack, I thought. What did you think of the music in the film?
I mean, I kind of alluded to this because I want to prep people from hating me for this, but I'm not a big Elvis guy. So I was watching this movie and I was like, I don't really recognize these songs, but I just guess they're like deep cuts or something because I don't know a bunch of Elvis. But yeah, they're singing, but they're not real Elvis songs. And there's music that seems of the time, but is intentionally anachronistic, pulled out of 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 2000s, 2010s. It comes intentionally from all over the map, which it wasn't a conscious choice on their parts. They were trying to get Elvis's music. This is a movie that is intentionally critical of Elvis. His estate was like, no, thank you. We're not going to aid you in this. So there's no Elvis music for that reason. So it was an outside force, but I think it actually was a gift to them because when I was saying like this movie is sparse, kind of oddly evocative of a time that doesn't exist, it is intentionally specific yet obscure, and it creates this almost alternate reality where you don't get a good look at where you are. You just get a good look at these two characters. And when you're telling a story about Priscilla Presley, who we all know, and then Elvis Presley, who we all have this parasocial relationship with, when you take away his music, you take away that legendary status that you already have in your mind. So it becomes less about this iconographic guy and more about this real relationship between these two random people that you still get the dynamic of he's famous, we understand, but you don't get the actual relationship that you've already built up in your mind with Elvis, which obviously Baz Luhrmann's movie came a little bit ago. And I think that went an entirely different route when it comes to picturing that man.
Yes, totally different route. And I'm glad you brought that up because, Alison, I want to talk about the fact that we are just a year out from another biopic about Elvis made by Baz Luhrmann starring Austin Butler. And it's kind of hard not to lump these two films in together, though they are strikingly different. What did you sort of notice about the two perspectives at play in Priscilla and Elvis?
Well, I think they complement each other in ways that it actually works out well, I think, because like Elvis, like the Baz Luhrmann Elvis is just so obviously like very focused on Elvis, but also very focused on Elvis as like a dynamic performer, I think the best parts of that movie are when Austin Butler as Elvis is on stage and doing like a pretty good job of making you understand why this was such a revolution for people when they saw, Elvis on stage for the first time, which I think can be really difficult. And in Priscilla, we barely get Elvis to perform at all. I think we get like one shot of him from the back. But like Priscilla, the character has been shut off from Elvis as his public figure. He kind of keeps her at home. He keeps saying like, you got to keep the home fires burning. I'm not gonna do this. I almost did it.
Please do the accent. I think we all should.
But, I think that in that same way where the music is left out, I think that there's something about like where you only get like private domestic Elvis, who is this, and you kind of have to grapple with him as this guy who wants things how he wants them and kind of expects her to just be waiting there. I think that these two movies actually coexist really well, and they have like different, very distinctive aesthetics that I think also coexist.
Now, we kind of mentioned this, but before the show started, I was complaining to you both about how much I missed the horniness in this movie, how badly I wanted to have some sort of, like sexual payoff. Anything about the film that didn't work for you? Jackson, I'll start with you.
I mean, if I can weave this together, I think that's really interesting because like, jumping off of what you were just saying, Alison, I think that this movie shows the same things that the movie called Elvis shows, where Elvis is a man who is so desirous of affection. He has this hole inside himself that he needs to be filled with people loving him. Elvis is about the audience loving him, and it is kind of a humanistic portrayal that makes you feel really happy for him because he didn't want the riches of the fame. He just wanted to satisfy the audience. That's a great relationship. But when we have this movie, Priscilla, where he has the same desire, he needs to be loved, he needs to be affirmed. But instead of getting it from the general audience, he gets it from a specific person. He traps her, puts her in a house, gives her nothing. And then he'll like, when she gets pregnant, he'll be like, we should take a break. And he wants her to say, no, don't leave me. But she refuses to give him that validation. So that hurts him. So it's all about him cutting her off from the world. And it's a really interesting movie to tell. But when you tell that movie for almost 2 hours and the main thrust of the movie is Priscilla has almost nothing in her life and she's been cut off from everything, it gets a bit hard to sustain that theme directly for so long. And it gets a little bit, it's spare and sparse and interesting and delicate, but 2 hours, you're like, okay, we need a little bit more, maybe, or at least that's a little bit of what I felt. You mentioned the lack of horiness. That was also obviously something that removed that interesting quality from it. So it feels more like a series of vignettes and like short films that have kind of been put together in a way that is really interesting, really impressive, but maybe just by the end of the runtime, you're like, okay, can we mine something else? I mean, in the Spencer movie, Lorraine did it by showing fantastical, imaginative scenes that didn't really exist to get you into what was going on in her head. We don't really get a picture of what's going on in Priscilla's head very much until the end.
And Alison, what didn't work for you in this movie?
I think that it's a really strong movie for the first 2/3. And I think this fits in with what Jackson was saying. I think the final third, where you start to see her pull away, it feels like the movie is almost like less interested in that aspect of the story. And I think that's in part because, Sofia Coppola has always like really been great at adolescence, at girlhood, with all of its like pains, but all of its kind of like pleasures as well. And I think that once it becomes about Priscilla as this independent woman who is starting to, explore things she actually wants and starting to separate herself from being just kind of an accessory on the superstar's life, I do feel like the movie feels like it just kind of starts hurrying up. Like it's less granular, it's less kind of present with her, and it's more just kind of like rushing towards the end for me. And I thought that the end felt a little anticlimactic for me, given, and you want that triumph when she's leaving, you want there to be something a little more, but it didn't feel that way for me.
Yeah, I kind of felt the same way, especially focusing on that word climax. But anyways, thank you both so much for chatting Priscilla with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Jackson Weaver is an entertainment reporter at CBC in Toronto. Alison Willmore is a film critic at Vulture in New York. Okay, before we go, there's something I got to talk about. Now, you may have heard this week that Gannett, the biggest newspaper chain in the U.S., introduced the world to its newest reporter. Brian West has been hired after a lengthy recruitment campaign to cover Taylor Swift, and only Taylor Swift, full time. And of course, it's the Swiftie universe. There's already been some rumblings. While some stands are upset that this dream job has gone to a 35-year-old man, others are pressed that he's not just a journalist, he's also a huge Taylor Swift fan. Well, look, either way, let's face it, when it comes to covering Taylor, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. On the one hand, if you're too critical of her music, the fans will destroy you online. And if you're not critical enough, the rest of the world will question your journalistic chops. So while West may feel he's won the gig of a lifetime, I think he might be in for a rude awakening. And it's not that I don't think the world's most influential performer, save for maybe Beyonce, is deserving of a dedicated reporter. If anything, it's been a long time coming. But hiring a fan to do it, I think, negates the responsibility that covering an artist like this with her outsized impact demands. You know that everything Taylor Swift does as a musician has a dramatic effect on the rest of the industry. That influence should be analyzed, criticized, and written about with some measure of objectivity. Of course, I'm not really sure you could find a critic and pay them enough money to actually take on the Swiftie army anyway. But in an era where the role of the critic is already increasingly in peril, hiring a fan just also doesn't do this beat any justice. So yes, it may have garnered them a bit of momentary hype, but I'm not really sure what Gannett hopes to accomplish with this new Swift-focused reporter. To me, it just kind of reinforces that it's Taylor Swift's world and we're just living in it. And that's it for the podcast today. Remember, you can listen to any episode of Commotion anytime, wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and make sure to check us out and follow us on Instagram. We're at Commotion CBC. I'm Amil Niazi, sitting in for Elamin Abdelmahmoud. Thanks so much for listening.